On the line, we have Virginia's Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli. Mr. Attorney General, great to have you on.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you having me on.
And today, the day that your new work comes out, The Last Line of Defense, your new book where you argue that the federal government and specifically President Obama's administration, which you call the biggest set of lawbreakers in America, are eroding individual liberties and exceeding constitutional boundaries. What the timing of putting your book out now, Mr. Attorney General, walk us through that.
Well, for starters, liberty's under assault, so you push back when the battle arises, and the timing is not necessarily of my choosing. Crown came to me about 18 months ago about writing this book, and what we've done is catalog example after example of how big government has become a serious threat to the very liberty it was instituted to protect. And so this book is about protecting liberty and how we're doing it from the states, not just Virginia, but a lot of states are participating in this. And it's interesting timing because Pew Research folks just came out with one of their recent surveys, and for the first time, it shows a majority of Americans believe the federal government is a threat to their personal rights and freedoms. It's over half of Americans believe that now. That's the highest in history that they've been polling that question. It isn't just Republicans. Independents feel that way too, and a good chunk of Democrats. So we have written about that battle to protect liberty from the federal government, and this is the federal government that was instituted to protect that liberty itself. So we've got this back and forth between the states and the federal government, and the Founding Fathers intended that the states would play this role to push back when the federal government does things like, you have the EPA rewrites the rules and laws. We beat them last month in court with a Fairfax County Democrat Board of Supervisors as our co-plaintiffs, so this is not partisan stuff.
Right.
This is just basic rule of law. And even after that, the president lost on his NLRB appointments, supposedly, quote, recess appointments. The Senate gets to decide when they're in recess, not the president.
Exactly.
And the courts finally stuck that back to him. So they're losing a lot of these because they're so egregiously overstepping the bounds of their authority. And we need to push back from the states. Attorneys general are leading the way in doing that, and this book is cataloging that effort to fight back.
Now, there's no question, as you outlined in your work, that there is a definite assault on states' rights and individual liberty. Mr. Attorney General, why hasn't this showed up in public opinion surveys? Because it's having no negative impact on President Obama's approval ratings.
Well, in 2010, I ran for Attorney General in 2009, and we immediately were implementing our strategy, our federalism strategy of pushing back on the federal government. And when people were running for Attorney General in 2010, they altered how they were campaigning across the country. And we didn't see it in Virginia as much, although I did it to a lesser degree. People were literally running federalism campaigns for Attorney General. Usually it's, I'm a prosecutor, top cop, that kind of thing. I didn't run that way, but that's pretty common. These folks were openly running on pushing back on the federal government, and a swath of them got elected this way. So now there's a collection of it. So you're right, 2012 was disappointing, but 2012 isn't all there is. We have been filling the ranks of state officials who are willing to push back on the federal government over the last 3 years, inspired very heavily by the fights that the federal government is thrusting upon us. It isn't us go picking these fights. We're playing defense. That's why the name of the book is The Last Line of Defense, and that last line is the states themselves and attorneys general in those states. And it's particularly relevant when we've got a president about to give his State of the Union address at the beginning of his second term, when he isn't going to be reined in by the concern of getting reelected. Believe it or not, we probably have already seen the restrained term of President Obama and his administration. This administration is very aggressive. They don't seem to care a great deal about what the law says in terms of boundaries of the authority of these agencies.
No question. Common Sense News Time coming up on 8:50. This is the John Frederick Show. We're with Attorney General of Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli. He's also the presumptive Republican nominee for governor of the Commonwealth. That election will be in November. Mr. Attorney General, you just went on the offensive against your presumptive Democratic opponent in the gubernatorial campaign, former DNC chair Terry McAuliffe, and your campaign criticized McAuliffe for starting a car company in Mississippi in lieu of Virginia. Do you think that matters?
Oh, my gosh, it matters. I mean, where they were looking in Virginia was where we have the longest term, most persistent unemployment in the whole state. It's around the Danville and Martinsville areas of Henry County, that area, and it was like a bait and switch. I mean, they were going down to visit sites in those very poor parts of Virginia, and the day before they went, if I remember my dates correctly, they announced, well, we're going to Mississippi instead. And it was pretty painful for folks down there who really need to see more work, really need to see more jobs, all in the face of this federal onslaught that we've been fighting back against, where you get more regulation and it gets harder and harder to start businesses. And so when Terry McAuliffe even attempts to do it, he thinks it's better to do in Mississippi. And I don't know why he would ask the people of Virginia to make him their governor if what he cares about is in Mississippi and in other places. So he's going to have to defend that the whole year, and I don't think there's any good defense as demonstrated by his continual flip-flopping and not telling the truth about how that process took place. The Associated Press and PolitiFact and all of those folks, none of whom are rightward leaning, have already taken him to task on this,
right.
Thoroughly documenting his failure here. But this particularly hurt parts of Virginia that are being hurt the most by the federal regulatory onslaught. People need to remember that the people hurt first and worst by these kinds of across-the-board regulations by the EPA, the NLRB, the FCC. All these federal agencies are the poor. They lose opportunities more quickly. They lose flexibility more quickly. It's as inevitable as gravity. It's a simple law of economics, and we're very worried about that in the second term of this president. We've cataloged in the last line of defense about how we've been pushing back in this first term of the president and this administration, and we is an awful lot of the states. It isn't just Virginia. I hope people will grab it at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. We also have a website, LastLineBook.com, where they can go. And unfortunately, it's not a Democrat habit alone. Republicans have done this too, where they've overused federal power. But right now, we're seeing an administration that, in our lifetimes, yours and mine, has been unmatched in its willingness to cross that line.
And it's only going to get worse.
It's only going to get worse. And states need to push back, and that's exactly what the founding fathers had in mind. And we're fulfilling their vision in the 21st century.
Now, staying with politics for a minute, Mr. Attorney General, you are unequivocally regarded as one of the most politically potent grassroots campaigners in the nation. Your ground game acumen is widely acknowledged as a key to your campaign success. In a word, there's no one I know that's better at grassroots campaigning than Ken Cuccinelli. And I know, Mr. Attorney General, from personal experience by many of our live interviews together on the air on my show, that you were personally intricately involved in the 2012 victory effort to carry Virginia for the Republican ticket. Now, you wouldn't believe what some people are peddling to our radio organization for coverage, so I'm going to get right to it. There's a lot of attempts to pin the November defeat, that loss, on your campaign manager, David Rexroad, the former executive director of Virginia Victory, and also on its chairman, Pete Snyder, who's now a candidate for lieutenant governor, and basically.
Well, John, let me cut you off a little bit. I mean, I have been involved in grassroots politics for over 20 years, and we have the blessing or curse to do it every single year in Virginia. As Governor McDonnell likes to say, Virginia's for lovers of elections. And we have them every year. I have never, ever seen more sincere, heartfelt, raw man hours poured into a campaign than in 2012. And it was executed just as it was planned out of Boston. If something happened differently, it would have been to break away from their plan. So we were executing it as they had requested. And unfortunately, it was a little too centralized. It was a little too stiff. And especially when you compare that to what was going on the other side, where they were using technology not merely to grind through more contacts, but to personalize those contacts. They were not changing politics. They weren't changing it from one-on-one campaigning. They were making it easier for their volunteers to do it better. And that's a good course to be on. They did much better than we did on the ground in that respect, and we need to respect their effort and their accomplishment. And we also need to catch back up on that. And I think I'm a pretty good candidate to do that, given my long-term commitment, as you noted, to grassroots campaigning. We're about building. We're about growing. And that's how we've always won our races. It's also how you grow the Republican Party. It's how you get a mandate to make changes to the tax system, to make changes to the transportation system that we're going to campaign on, and to continue pushing back on the federal government.
So
governors have a role in this too. It isn't just attorneys general.
If you could do it all over again, would you have made David Rexrode the executive director of Victory 2012? And would you have made Pete Snyder, who's now a candidate for lieutenant governor, the chairman of Virginia Victory 2012?
Yes. Next question.
Do you think they did a good job? Really?
They did yeoman's work. Yes, they did. We're going to run a better grassroots campaign in 2013 than the presidential campaign ran in 2012. And a big part of how we're going to be able to do that is because Dave Rexrode is totally committed to grassroots. That's why I was happy to bring him on board as campaign manager, is he shares my commitment and our whole team's, existing team's commitment to grassroots campaigning, to not just trying to win this election, but to build a team that can go forward to implement a good, positive agenda for more limited government in Virginia that makes Virginians' lives better and attacks the transportation problem, advances our opportunities in the economy. That starts with a good ground game, and Dave Rexrode is committed to that just as I am. So, yes, I think anybody, that's silly talk, frankly, to blame them for 2012. It's just silly talk.
All right.
You know, we're more focused on converting our record as AG, fighting the federal government and pushing back on the federal government into a full-blown gubernatorial platform, which involves many more issues, but it will continue to involve pushing back on the federal government. It'll be interesting to see. I'm sure Terry McAuliffe will be on your show someday. I know that's a joke.
We can't find him, but you'll be the first to know if we get him on. Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, we want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much for being on today. You can go to kencuccinelli.com, and all eyes are going to be on Virginia in 2013. This is the John Frederick Show.